Minecraft is one of the most recognizable games in the world. Ask almost any boomer what this texture is, and there's a good chance they'll recognize it as Minecraft. Minecraft has some of the most famous and iconic textures and mobs in all of gaming history, and for a period of roughly 10 years, the textures remained almost the same, with only minor or slight color and shading differences occurring as the game left alpha and beta versions. And then it all changed. In 2019, with the release of Minecraft 1.14, the Village and Pillage update, the Minecraft textures saw a massive overhaul with virtually all in-game textures changing, besides a few iconic ones such as the creeper and grass. This was met with a lot of controversy at the time, but these days opinion has shifted. So why did the textures change, and which Minecraft textures are truly better? Well, let's go back to when the grass was a beautifully eye-piercing neon green, rivaling the saturation of the average YouTube thumbnail. The original Minecraft textures were made by Notch, and over time various developers and artists would contribute and add textures of their own as the game updated and new items, blocks and mobs were added. This little factoid will become more important later on, but for now let's talk about the themes of the older textures and how they changed. Initially, many of the alpha and beta textures, such as cobblestone, were much more noisy, had a thicker or darker outline, and were quite saturated. You can see in this side by side how the textures are significantly smoother in modern versions of the game. I think the cobblestone blocks development throughout Minecraft Classic and Pre-Classic is a great representation of the game's core design themes and how they changed over time, but still formed the backbone of the game's textures overall, with many textures having significantly greater noise and saturation the further back you go in Minecraft versions. This boxy, noisy, pixel-like and distinct style would come to be adored by players all around the world in what's commonly referred to as the golden age of Minecraft. The newer Minecraft textures were first publicly showcased in 2017, designed by Japper, a texture artist who now works for Mojang. Japper's textures were significantly less noisy, smoother, pleasant, with a lighter contrast, therefore making them more readable. They were made to be less eye-straining, less distracting, and to look cleaner overall. In general, the textures became softer, their shading not as noticeable, and the sharpness toned down significantly. Japper transformed the Minecraft textures, making them seem a lot more refined and having less of that indie game design feel. But almost immediately upon their announcement and showcase, there was widespread concern. You see, the community found out that the Mr. Epic still wasn't at 500k subs yet, an atrocity of the highest levels which only you can fix, no pressure. Anyways, the community realized that this was no small texture change. It wouldn't just affect textures that nobody cared about, such as Diorite, a texture famous for its inspiration being drawn from literal bird poo. No, this was a change to some of the most iconic textures in gaming history. Don't fix what isn't broken was the key argument, with many players stating that they severely disliked the direction or theme of the new textures. It was understandable, as players had become accustomed to the Minecraft textures over the past decade, having a strong affection or nostalgia towards many of them. Furthermore, the Minecraft community at the time was notorious for being against change, especially around 2017, as players still had 1.9, the combat disaster, fresh in their mind. So why did Mojang decide to change Minecraft's textures, of which nobody ever complained about? Well, there are a few reasons. First and foremost, Minecraft's textures were a bit outdated. Most of the textures hadn't seen significant updates or really any changes in years. It's very common for online games to revamp their HUDs or certain textures as they update and get older, but Minecraft is a game which never really got such treatment. Considering the game had seen a newfound spark of interest, and with updates becoming larger and more game-changing, Mojang may have wanted Minecraft to seem fresh or revitalized, and slightly modifying the game's textures would do so. It may have just been for the sole purpose of trying to regain or get the interest of older players by making the game seem slightly different than before. But what I think was the biggest reason for the changes was actually stated by Japper himself on his Twitter. I think all the original textures look horrible. Yes, they work, but there are different styles in the game, and most blocks are just a noise filter. All the blocks have a lot of colors that only adds eyesore. Basically, the fact that a lot of individuals had contributed to Minecraft's textures over the years meant that they didn't all match or fit one another and an overall consistent theme, with Japper further stating that they don't always fit the biomes and areas they were meant to be in. This is often why many players think the newer textures have a nicer feeling to them, because they are much more consistent with one another and are easier on the eyes. Furthermore, since 1.16 we have received a lot of new blocks and variations of blocks in the game. As more textures get added to the game, ensuring that they all remain distinguishable and unique is important, and I believe Japper was brought in for that very reason. So, while the community was initially against any changes to the textures, Jappa's clean, smooth and easy on the eye design slowly but steadily grew on players. They became pleasant to play with many players stating that they began to see all the issues with the older textures now that they had used the newer ones for a sufficient amount of time. I did a poll asking you guys if you preferred the old or new textures, and 75% of you preferred the newer textures. If I had asked that same question back in 2018 or early 2019, it likely would have been significantly closer. Many of you mentioned how the newer textures were a lot clearer, they felt familiar to use and nicer to look at. In general, it seems that the playability of Jappa's textures were much higher than the playability of the older textures, and as the game continues to update and add new blocks and items, playability only becomes more important but harder to achieve. Other players mentioned that the newer textures were basically the old ones but improved. The best example of this would be Glass, which I do agree looks much smoother, clean and less noisy compared to its older counterpart. Wheat is another example of a fitting upgrade to an older and now considered outdated texture. Diorite also looked a bit less like bird poo, so that scores a point in my book. As time went on, it seemed that the general opinion on the newer textures only improved. But there are a few issues with the newer textures. One of the key blocks players cited as having the most ugly texture, which they are glad Jappa changed, is Netherrack. This is very interesting to me because I think Netherrack is the one texture which Jappa got the most wrong. The Nether is meant to be a hellish, dangerous biome of which the players are meant to feel scared and vulnerable in. I remember that the first time I ever saw the Nether was when I watched X's Adventures in Minecraft back in 2011. Upon going to the Nether for the first time, X ended up in a little small Nether cave of which it was closely surrounded by Netherrack blocks. Upon seeing this, I immediately felt very uneasy and uncomfortable, and those effects were only amplified as X continued to journey deeper into the Nether cave made up of seemingly endless Netherrack blocks. The texture of Netherrack stood out to me a lot, and I remember thinking that it looked very off-putting and really emphasized those feelings of hopelessness and fear you should experience when entering the Nether for the first time. The newer netherite texture I severely dislike. It's far too placid and clean, more like a red cobblestone than a block from a hellish dimension. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable or uneasy at all, but rather like I'm in an alien alternative to the overworld where the color red is more common. The newer netherite texture does look better than the older one if you compare the two textures without the context of the nether, and that's where the problem lies. The nether is meant to be ugly and hellish, which is why the old netherite block is far more fitting. There are a few other blocks which I know are disliked as well. The melon block looks very odd and ironically looks more noisy, saturated and unappealing than the old melon block. I also know that quite a few people dislike the look of the newer ores, which once again are much noisier than their older counterparts. And fortunately for those players, including myself, we still have access to the older textures in the form of programmer art. But programmer art also has some issues. When new blocks and items are added to the game, they only get new textures, meaning they don't exactly match the older textures. This can be overlooked in some cases, but with blocks such as warped nylium and nether gold ore, these inconsistencies are really noticeable. This problem will only get worse as Minecraft continues to update and add new content in the future. It would be nice if Mojang had another texture artist continuing to adapt or update the older textures, but alas, we aren't that fortunate. However, the community has taken matters into their own hands, and utilizing community-made resource packs has allowed for some of these inconsistencies to be resolved. But enough discussion now. Which textures are better? First, I'm going to give my opinion, which keep in mind is obviously subjective and biased. As I'm sure you all know from watching my videos, I prefer the older textures. Some of my favorite blocks in the game include the many types of wood and leaves, as well as stone, grass, wooden planks, stone bricks, and more. I personally really dislike the newer stone and oak wood textures the most, as I think they look too blurry and cartoony. Here's a side-by-side of oak logs. The older texture looks more noisy, yes, but also looks more defined, deeper, and personally more distinguishable from the other wood types. The newer texture looks more blurry, cartoony, smooth, and lighter. It looks more watercolor, so to say. Now, before you all leave an angry comment, I do know that the features I praise the old oak log texture for are generally not ideal in graphic design, but for some reason, likely due to my own bias, I just cannot bring myself to like the newer oak logs. And to be clear, it's not just oak logs which I have this problem with. I also think the same of many other blocks like stone, stone bricks, cobblestone, and more. Stone looks far too linear? Not sure how to describe it, but I think older stone merges and fits much better together. Just remember, this is all my opinion. So let me take a step back and look at it objectively. The newer Minecraft textures are generally agreed upon by majority of the player base and you guys my viewers to be cleaner, easier and nicer to play with. Overall, they are more playable. 75% of you saw the newer textures as an improvement over the older ones, therefore clearly my opinion is in the minority here. So does that mean that the newer textures are better than the older ones? Well, here's my answer. I think in terms of playability, the newer textures are better. They are easier on the eyes, smoother, more distinguishable, and altogether have the same theme and therefore fit well. However, I think there are more core blocks which have older textures that fit the theme of Minecraft better. Stone, netherrack, wooden ores maybe were noisier, but I believe that actually made them more distinct, recognizable, and memorable. I think the over-smoothification of some of Minecraft's most core textures actually made them look worse. So, to conclude on what Minecraft textures are better, at least in my opinion, I believe a mix of both is best. I would say a resource pack made up of 20 to 25% of the old but core textures and then 70 to 75% of the newer textures would strike the perfect balance. But at the end of the day, Diorite still looks trash. And that's my opinion. Leave a comment with your own thoughts. Also, I'm running a poll on my Twitter about the textures, so respond to that now that you've finished the video. Be sure to subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching.